am a choral conductor and a music educator. I believe passionately in the unique and civilizing force of great music. Great music comes from great minds, geniuses. But these geniuses need an environment in which to flourish. This is why there are periods of intense flourishing of creative genius throughout history. Tudor England, the Italy of Monteverdi that we're going to hear later, Vienna of the late 1700s, the Germany of Schumann and Brahms, one of David's great favorites. And also why there are long fallow periods, such as the Dark Ages in the West. So much has to be in place, not least patronage, education, enlightened leadership, and freedom of ideas. An aesthetic standard by which society can be judged that trumps everything else. The very roots of the tree to the furthest branches of society have to be conducive. Add to that a degree of the hunger of personal ambition, Haydn, for example, and very often personal or historic trauma, when individuals tend to dig deep into their creative reserves, and the things in life that create tsunami drive in an individual, and of course, a receptive public. What really matters in life? How can we really live life deeply and fully? A couple of years ago, someone who might be called David Tang came to Cambridge University to talk to the Students' Chinese Society and made this point so brilliantly. The students, pens poised, waited for advice from the legendary entrepreneur as to how they should make their fortunes after business school. David said, forget business school, it's useless. Listen to this. And he played a recording very loudly of Brahms' Third Symphony, I think, third movement. It could have been that he was too lazy to write a speech. His son later told me, at the start of the journey to Cambridge, in the back of the car, David had said something that rhymes with duck. I haven't written a speech, and promptly fell asleep. But the point he made with the Brahms to the bewildered students was most powerful. What is music? What is the extent of its power on the common soul and intellect? The mystery of music. Nietzsche called it mysterium tremendum. It could be the last act of Tristan, or it could be just 8 bars or 4 bars of Mozart. Somehow it makes us feel we are part of a universal soul. What could be more transcendental? Music does more than literature can. George Steiner refers to 3 dimensions which transcend anything possible by the power of word alone. Pure maths, God, and music. Maybe they're all one and the same. The theory of everything. What else can give us such hope of a transcendent possibility than music? It's a terrifying thought to me that it might no longer be an assumed and fundamental part of education. Every educated person should be able to take part in music making of some sort, however amateur, as once was the case in 19th century Europe. To some extent, I see evidence of this in middle-class China. I taught music at DGS in Hong Kong, Daughters and Girls School, for 12 years. Chinese children taught in English. Almost all the children learnt an instrument, mostly the piano. I had 9 grade 8 students. We had 9 grade 8 students one year under the age of 12. Everyone must have the opportunity to have those regions of the soul touched in a way that only great art and specifically music can. So this brings me to some of the basic questions that we all have the responsibility to contemplate. What distinguishes a civilized society from a barbarous one? Who is the arbiter of this? And do we as individuals, should we have the ultimate responsibility to contribute to the betterings of society? If we decide the answer to this last question is yes, where do we start? First of all, we need to define our roles, or multiple roles. As a parent, as a voter, as a contributor to society via our chosen career or vocation. It seems to me that great music, far from being a recreational frill, is central to these issues. This evening, I'm going to outline my own visions and theories about music's role in our lives, in society and in education. I like to think of music in three categories. First, functional music. It's a name I made up. Music we are compelled to make, usually through singing, against injustice, to go to war, for ritual, to worship, to unite against a common enemy. We find many examples of this type of functional music in African communities. Formerly, in Eastern Bloc countries, for example Estonia, oppressed by foreign powers for 800 years, the only way a mother could pass the mother tongue to the next generation was through singing indigenous folk songs to the baby. In England, the only example today of functional singing is on the football terraces. Nobody's told them to sing. Uniting in song is the only way completely to unite and to express a powerfully common emotion. Is there an example of greater communal passion from the depths of one's being than a Manchester United supporter singing against Liverpool? It's certainly the case that the more urban and noisy our world becomes, we hear now more music and noise around us than any other time in human history, the more functional music recedes. My second category of music is recreational music, music composed by mankind for mankind, both popular and high art. The third category of music is universal music, the frequencies and vibrations that make up this universe. Rudolf Steiner said, the human being is musically creative or sensitive music because these sounds are already present in the human being's sentient astral body. A sort of music of the spheres, if you like, a theory based on mathematical principles, which I'll touch on later. Now, here's a question for you. Does music shape society, or does society shape music? A book by David Tame called The Secret Power of Music fascinated me. I became obsessed with it. After living in Hong Kong for 12 years, and I was the fifth generation born and raised in the Far East, I felt equally connected to the Eastern philosophies as to the Western Enlightenment values. And this is why the book gripped me. In his book, David Tame outlines his theory that music shapes society, and he gives examples. In several ancient cultures, music was seen as a force that needed to be controlled in order to keep society from changing. In today's more barbaric regimes, we see the same. Why, for example, does the Taliban ban all forms of music except incantations from the minaret and other tightly controlled religious functions? Because it's a way of suppressing the independence of mind and progress in society. In ancient China, thousands of years ago, the cycle of fifths had been worked out long before Pythagoras, whose comma theory out of the cycle of fifths, which I'll demonstrate later, supported the notion of infinity and perhaps reincarnation for Eastern cultures. Music in very ancient China was strictly controlled to vast massed choirs and strings intoning one of 12 semitones created by the cycle of fifths at one particular time of the calendar. 12 semitones, 12 hours, 12 months. This was the way the human could align himself with the celestial forces. Music was the universe. Legend has it that imperial squads were dispatched to areas of China to prevent other self-indulgent, corrupting forms of music making. You could say that this certainly had the effect of stabilizing Chinese society for hundreds, if not thousands of years, to stop it from progressing, if you like, to prevent independence of mind. And in ancient India, the Om had a similar function in terms of human alignment with the celestial forces. Much later, Pythagoras, around 500 BC, developed his mathematical theories directly from music. Music, mathematics, the universe, to him, were all one and the same. This has become known as the music of the spheres. Pythagoras identified that the pitch of a musical note is in proportion to the length of string or wire that produces it, and that the intervals between harmonious sound frequencies form simple numerical ratios. He proposed that the sun and the moon all emit a hum, an orbital resonance, and that our quality of life reflects the tenor of celestial sounds. Plato later described astronomy as music. It's worth mentioning here that the medieval quadrivium of the 6th century, that is the 4 central pillars of education, were astronomy, geometry, arithmetic, and music. What are our pillars of education today? The cycle of fifths, worked out by Pythagoras and previously by the Chinese, of course they always chomp us to these great discoveries, is one of the most fascinating discoveries of all mankind. Here is what it looks and sounds like. As you descend in perfect fifths, or ascend, you never get back to the same starting point, hence the Pythagorean comma theory. Up a fifth, up another fifth, 5 notes. The cycle of fifth continues now. In the West, medieval, oh, we don't need that. In the West, medieval monophony, mono equals one, phonos sound. In music, it's a single line or a single voice. Think of it as a soliloquy. And plain chant developed into polyphony, poly, many, phonos, sound. Polyphony can just be 2 lines. But if you have 2 lines together, it creates harmony. Harmony required rules, both for elegance and for religious control, because it impacts emotion, both positively and negatively. For example, the tritone, the augmented fourth, diminished fifth, is the most dissonant of all intervals, and it's known to have been banned in certain contexts and referred to as the devil's interval. Today, this can happen in gospel music. A very good friend of mine has been excommunicated from the Seventh-day Adventists for playing forbidden blues chords because they create certain undesirable emotive responses. Move forward to Bach now. Bach's well-tempered clavier. Mean temperament with Bach was established. With all the pure ratios that we've just seen there, being adjusted to fit into the perfect octave. Basically, so you could play all 24 keys without having to retune the harpsichord for each new key. From this point onwards, over the subsequent 300 years plus, from 1700 to now, music has come more and more away from the linear, with the natural tension and release of the melody on the breath, towards the sensuous, pleasing to the senses, towards the individual, I suppose the perfect example is the lush and exquisite soundscapes of Ravel and Debussy. Their harmonies, beautiful chords, tonalities, textures, colors dominate. Ultimately, this Western harmonic tonal language was pushed so far, Wagner's Tristan chord was the symbolic breaking point, that it resulted in the total breakdown of tonality. David Thames' example of how music can change society via the influence of voodoo from Africa, via jazz to rock music, resulted, which was the antithesis of where we began with plain chant and monophony, i.e. the relentless thud of a beat in a rock concert, which excites the system and sets up a reliance on a heightened state to those overexposed to it. This is his theory, that this then results in the heartbeat synchronizes, and at a certain level of decibels, even protein can coagulate. If you put an egg on a loudspeaker at a certain number of decibels, it will cook. And hence the need for drugs to recreate this heightened state. So music has a profound influence on us, and indeed could be said to shape society before we shape it. So what should be the musical diet of young people to produce a balanced individual? I like to use the food analogy. If you eat a balanced diet of fish, rice, meat, vegetables, fruit, then you can have a Big Mac twice, 3 times, 4 times a week. You're not malnourished. If you live on Big Mac, you have a problem. And so with your cultural diet, I feel the soul needs to be nourished in exactly the same way. But the most important thing to say about music in today's world is it is the vehicle by which the greatest creative achievements of mankind reach us. Quite simply it is, to quote George Steiner again, the privilege of being. I want now to talk a little bit about my latest work, safeguarding, or attempting in my modest way to safeguard the future of classical music. I had dinner with a leading publisher 2 nights ago. She told me that the New York Times used to employ over 50 arts correspondents. Now they've reduced that to a number to 4. This is perhaps the tip of some monster iceberg. What does it imply? What are the ways to safeguard great art, and specifically the future of great classical music in live performance for future generations, and why is it important? We can look at today's 16 to 22-year-olds. You probably all have one in your family. Why that ideal demographic? Why should we look at that demographic? Because by 16, we're ready to start forming sophisticated ideas about how we relate to the world. Education, for the most part, falls grossly short. Parents, for the most part, invest insufficient time to redress the balance. When I was 16, it was the Matthew Passion and other seminal works that forced me, both as a performer and a listener, out of my confines. Cultural diets of today's young consist of reality television, YouTube shorts, over-manufactured synthetic pop music. Of course, there is high quality music of all genres, but it is the exception. 5 years ago, I had a light bulb moment. I went to Wilton's Music Hall, I don't know if you know it, in Spitalfields. A singing ensemble called I Fagiolini, the Little Beans, were performing, wait for it, Alice in Wonderland. You can imagine what fun it was, a new and brilliant way of presenting Renaissance music. My first thought was, my children would love this. My second thought was, they never come to concerts like the way I used to with my father. I used to beg my father to take me to concerts. Then I looked at the packed audience, highly appreciated, all grey hair. There was no one in the audience as young as the oldest performer. I now realize in the late 70s, in many ways were the glory days of live music performance for a multi-generational audience in cultural capitals in the West. And paradoxically, today, we have ever-increasing numbers of professional musicians at an ever-increasing standard of excellence. We've researched through photographs and whatever data we can, and we estimate that 20% of audiences 30 years ago were in the 16 to 22-year-old demographic. That has dwindled now to 1 to 2%. But to restore the 20%, we must re-engage young people. That is a complex and multifaceted challenge. And should we rest on our laurels? Should we listen to those who claim there is no threat? Who see the Albert Hall crammed with young people at the last night of the proms? Just look at the cracks in America. Orchestras and opera companies closing down. No statutory music in schools. Arts being the first to be cut. Complacency is not an option. So I created Vocal Futures. Absolutely today.
The idea of working with that material, which is not spontaneously designed to be a theatrical performance, you have to be inspired. It's like no classical concert I've ever been to, but I think it's like one that I've always wanted to go to.
Years ago, if you went to a London concert hall, 20% of the audience would have been around the age of 16 to 22. Since then, there's been a steep decline of that demographic attending live classical concerts. And we think that this is quite worrying. So what Vocal Futures is trying to do is to explore ways in which we can reignite young people to be fascinated by great classical music. Our first production, we chose the Matthew Passion of Bach. The reason I chose that piece was that that was the music that really blew me away when I was age 16. And so it seemed to make sense to take a piece that has the potential to really change the way you think about the world. So I designed this scheme for what we call the Young Ambassadors. There's an induction where the young ambassadors, these are susceptible young people who have never attended concerts or attended very few concerts. They come into the world of Matthew Passion and start understanding the issues around it and start absorbing the music. What was very interesting was that gives you an idea, anyway. I think that's probably enough of that, yeah. Okay. It gives you an idea, and the young man went on to say something which just made it all worthwhile. He said, it wasn't hearing music, it was experiencing music. And he said that unprompted. I promise I didn't actually write his script, but that to me was made everything valid. I appreciate the reverse trend might be the case in Asia. I hope so, although an exponentially speedy morphing of societies across the globe into one massive global reality television, celebrity insane, acquisitive, screen-dominated international lava lamp of humanity seems a terrifying possibility. And finally, to music education and neuroscience. There are 3 disciplines in which there's true child prodigy, maths, music, and chess. This proves, to my logic, that these are endemic to the human brain as they relate to the way the brain likes to pattern. The acquisition of these 3 disciplines requires a spiral of learning, and in the case of maths and music, a methodology and progression of learning. The value of music education, in my mind, is threefold. Firstly, developing our brain. We know musicians are cleverer than everybody else. A subject for another talk. Secondly, the complete personality. I won't go into detail, but we're all aware of the phenomenal value of music in developing basic skills, key basic skills of learning and social integration. Music is the source of balance and tolerance, as the late Lord Menuhin used to proselytize. But these 2 values of music are essentially utilitarian. The third and most important value of music is the intrinsic one of being close proximity to great beauty and fostering in developing minds and souls an aesthetic sensitivity. But bad music education, I think, is worse than no music education. If you subscribe, as I do, to the idea that we all have 10 intelligences, that's Howard Gardner's theory, of which music is the first, you will agree that the whole child will not develop into in a fully balanced way without a high-quality music education. The need to think of the whole child in education is paramount. The lessons I learnt in Hungary on my Churchill Fellowship travels back in 1990, which has defined my entire approach to music education over 25 years, is that singing should be at the heart of music education. The Hungarian Zoltán Kodály was the only individual in modern history who managed to convince an entire nation and put it into practice for every Hungarian child that music was central and indispensable in early education. Why is it that there are more Nobel Prize winners per capita in Hungary than any other country in the world? It's music education. So the Kodály principles are: music education must start with the voice. The ear can be trained, the heart can be trained long before the child is able to coordinate on an instrument. 2, this process must be from the earliest possible age, even in utero. The ears are fully formed from 11 weeks by the mother singing to the child through indigenous song material, nursery rhymes, folk song. And thirdly, that there must be a structured, experiential system of learning, not the Sainsbury's supermarket approach of a bit of this and a bit of that in the supermarket trolley. That's not music education. There's no meaningful music education without instruments, but singing must be the starting point. My Voices Foundation in the UK was formed to give general primary teachers, these are the people that are the custodians of our young, day in and day out, the skills and resources and confidence to teach every child as they teach all subjects. But like literacy and numeracy, music requires a progression of learning and a methodology like phonics in literacy, especially in pre-puberty education. The Voices Foundation has now worked with literally thousands of teachers and millions of children nationwide and has influenced policy. The government, you may not know, gave £30 million over 3 years to singing in primary schools. Can you give me an example of another country in the world that has done that? And we established a music manifesto, unique worldwide, and music is the only subject that has a national plan, thanks to our pioneering work. There are many, many of us, but I can claim we were the real pioneers of it. And we are the only organization in the plan recommended to all 19,000 primary schools for their curriculum and singing strategies that's not a government organization. Which brings me at last to where we stand with 21st century science, and specifically the role of brain imaging in quantifying what we already know anecdotally. There's a lot of bandwagoning on bad neuroscience, pseudoscience, by musicians and teachers desperate to prove the unique worthiness of their discipline, which is in the end counterproductive. The Mozart effect, rats go through mazes faster when they listen to Mozart, has been discredited almost as soon as it reached the newspapers. The brain imaging techniques available to us now are still quite crude, but there are some really interesting and credible studies that have underpinned what many of us have instinctively understood. The taxi driver study. Taxi drivers were wired up. The hippocampus, which is the spatial part of the brain, was much bigger in the taxi drivers than in the other people that they were tested again of the same age. This is important because it proves that the brain is much more plastic for much longer than we thought. Huge implications for education. Another study, the right hemisphere of the brain is the creative side, largely. The left brain is largely the logical side. We now know that the right brain grows faster than the left up to the age of 7. What does that tell us about education? The Scandinavians have been right all along, and the Hungarians. You don't test children young. You give them experiential, play-based, structured learning. And the third bit of very interesting research is singing and speech. Singing is a right brain activity. Speech is a left brain activity. That's why when stroke victims lose their speech, they can sing and be re-educated through back to language through song. It's why stammerers don't stammer when they sing. So brain imaging has helped. But I think we deny music education to our children at the greatest peril to humanity. When I established my bottom line for my children and my pupils, it took me years to work out what was my bottom line. This is what I came to. Number one, they should be able to think independent of consensus. Number two, they should respect all others. And I think having a bottom line helps clarify and focus one's contributions. Certainly music is central to developing those qualities. Going back to the question I asked at the beginning, who is the arbiter of a civilized society? It is, of course, each and every one of us. And now I'll leave the last word to the music itself. I created the London Youth Choir 2.5 years ago, which is 350 children in 5 choirs from all 32 boroughs. At the very top of the pyramid, so from 8 to 22, at the top of the pyramid are 16 choral scholars. And we have with them tonight one of my students, Isabel, and she's going to sing for us and to leave us with those parts of the soul that only music can reach. Isabel and Harry.